Okay, this is just a work in progress. Let's say I'm going to add one here. All right, so kind of thinking in very general terms about the relationship between entities. And so, part of what I want this to lead towards is this kind of an insight as to how civilizations behave and kind of politics in general, and the distance between ideology and reality, I guess you could say. But, rather than just observing political activities and events, it seems like a more substantial model would be one that is derived from biology. So if we think about how entities interact, let's say each one of these circles is an entity. And that this background here is kind of a field of environmental gradation, right? So you could just sort of say like, extreme cold, extreme heat, right? Dryness, moisture, what have you. Like all the variations, it's just sort of a general representation of variability in environment. And you have kind of this sweet spot somewhere in the middle, actually, yeah, I guess, that's probably not a bad way of thinking of it. So you have this kind of center line, and that's, let's say, like the Fertile Crescent, where it's most hospitable to a given form of life. Fertile Crescent, of course, is referring to humanity. But you do have life at the extremes, right? It's just that there's not a lot of, let's say, overlap, right? Whereas here in the where most of the action is, there's a lot of interaction between the various forms of life. So, I'm thinking of this as kind of like an immune system way of referring of like a model, basically having to do with the immune system. So let's say like you have an entity which has the most amount of power. So the size of the circle is kind of the amount of power. Now, obviously, there are going to be other entities which are vying for possession of that. I mean, even, something with less power, there's going to be something trying to attach to it, right? And that's essentially what happens with the body, right? The body, it has a certain amount of vitality that other things can sap from. So that's what, a lot of disease is basically some other organism starting to take over in the body, right? Whether it's cancer or some sort of bacterial infection. And then, we have the kind of competition amongst peers, different members of the same species, right? They are also vying for the sweet spot, right? There's competition for that sweet spot, but there's also, more or less interest in competing. So, when it comes to strategies for survival, the one which has the greatest benefit sort of enjoys that benefit the most. And so it has a position of relative comfort, but it's likely to be attacked by those who don't have the same benefit, the same comfort, and who are perhaps a bit more motivated. Usually the one who assumes this position of being, let's say, the big kahuna, they started by being in this position, right? If not completely outside of it, right? So sort of like, Napoleon, a bastard child on an island, just, in a sense, seeking revenge for the difficult position that he was placed in, then becoming in this position, right? So, we have now, like, let's say, large organizations that we can think of as being entities. So let's say, for example, Western civilization, having been kind of a backwater, eventually, compared to in ancient history, something like China, which was really the ascendant power, or India, right? So having been in a more, let's say, or rather less hospitable environment, it eventually finds a way to enter the game and attaches itself, right, through colonialism to these formerly great powers and starts to drag them down, right? Now, in these large organizations, what you get are you get this separation of basically specialization of work, right? So different functions are fulfilled by different types of individuals, different types of cells, you could say, similarly to what happens in the body. So maintaining that biological parallel, and so you end up with, like, let's say, those at the front line who are still relatively tough, right? And so there's this kind of interpenetration with those who you're fighting against. So that's like, basically the immune system defense. And then on the inside, you have kind of the endoplasm. You have the soft underbelly that consists of the people who are running the operations within the entity, right? The other organelles of the cell, you could say, right? And so it's very much sort of like a virus model where there's some sort of an attack happening at the perimeter, and there's an effort to establish a relationship so that the part of an entity like this, right? And they may leverage a relationship with another entity, right? And then get into this kind of a position where they're leveraging that other entity that's even further away from the center, has kind of more a tougher, kind of more brutalist mode of existence. And if they can get that to touch the big kahuna, then they're more likely to gain benefit. Right? They can absorb more than this one who's just the intermediary, right? If this one can steer someone else in that's even tougher and be kind of like, yeah, well, we can, do something about that. We might be able to rein them in, right? So like North Korea, right? So if we, I don't know that it necessarily functions this way, but China, right, has sort of attached itself to the United States, and North Korea is sort of this like bulldog, right, that saber rattles every now and then and causes a response here, maybe some kind of a deal, right? And that's like, then we'll rein this guy in, right? So the entity that has these ideals within the endoplasmic kind of operations. Should I say endoplasmic reticulum? I mean, is that an appropriate term here? There's a set of kind of rules and ideals that function within the interior, but those rules are suspended, right? All's fair in love and war, right? So kind of the reality on the frontier is really always quite different from whatever the ideals are that, and this sort of explains the corruption of ideals. So, the hypocrisy is essentially the extent to which the reality of the permeable membrane has actually penetrated to the interior. Because the games that are necessary in order to play with the bad boys who are out here, like you might even get a few of these guys wandering in here, right? They might find, like a Napoleon might end up somewhere in here, a warlord, right? That might eventually promote them to this kind of a position. And so the viciousness necessary is something that, civic society can't handle. Right, the rules in order to maintain a smooth functioning society are basically the opposite of the rules necessary in order to prevail in the harsh reality. Because it's essentially cutthroat here, and it's a cooperative here, right, in the center here. Yeah, maybe I should make this should be a radial gradient. right? So you could say that it kind of gets darker as you get to the edge, and there is this sort of lightness at the center, but it's dependent upon the barrier that surrounds it, right? That lightness can't exist without the protective layer of that vicious exterior, which is why every nation needs, in order to survive, it needs a very, very tough military. But the extent to which that tough military has to actually act in the world is the extent to which this light becomes dimmed as well. And ultimately, you could say almost disappears, right? And just kind of becomes a reflection of the viciousness at the exterior, which you could say is sort of part of a natural life cycle. That's sort of the progression, is that darkness eventually penetrates as more and more things attach to the entity and drag it down. It's kind of just an inevitable process of being worn down through the process of life, right? So let's say we're somewhere in this middle zone, right? Now, what is the way of avoiding this this circumstance? So the way of avoiding it is to not fight, is to go gently into that good night, right? The light gets brighter when you don't resist evil, which is literally what Jesus says, right? Do not resist evil. So you don't create the fighting on the edge, right? Which doesn't create hypocrisy on the inside. You allow yourself to go. It's if you don't fight, then they can just feast off your body. It's all good, no problem, right? Just take it. Go ahead. And then you're the innocent victim. There's a Girardian insight into the story of humanity, the story of civilization, which is that the victim is innocent, and that ultimately this is the only thing that undermines the power of the aggressor. So the darkness can only be lessened by the willingness to die. Let me be 100% clear here. I'm talking about in the face of the threat. In no way am I talking about some kind of suicidal mission here. One can be in the midst of absolute chaos and danger and never be confronted with the ultimate threat. That can happen, right? So what I'm discussing here is the moment of threat, the moment of aggression, and how one responds to it. And also in preparation for it. Because typically the preparation for aggression is to be able to summon aggression yourself, to be able to summon violence in anticipation of violence being visited upon you. But in this instance, the preparation is to summon peacefulness in the face of violence. So this is in no way suggesting any kind of a death wish. This is precisely and explicitly a insight into conflict dynamics and how the good is preserved, how the light is preserved, and how to prevent life from entering the realm of darkness, which is to say, to be willing to exit life. Now, there's an interesting twist here, which is that, of course, the warrior is someone who is eminently willing to risk the end of their lives. And so this isn't really fully addressing some of the details, some of the questions as to what the meaning of violence is, because you could just say, well, once the willingness to die has been achieved, then, may the best man win, if you like. So it's kind of like the samurai already dead concept, where they have the notion that death is honorable and not to be feared, and that what you're doing is fighting for the preservation of a way of life, fighting for the preservation of the people who you care about. And I'm not going to eliminate any of that as a real possibility. One can imagine that all of this has to do with the state of mind, and that if one is completely clear in one's purpose, then certainly defending something greater than yourself is a noble way to go. But the kind of base instinct of just preserving yourself, that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the darkness that descends when one is only concerned with one's own survival, and that there's nothing greater. Now, there may come a time when the idea of fighting for your family, for your community, for your nation is an abstract concept that has no basis in reality. And in that case, maybe you're fooling yourself if you think that's what you're going to do. And that ultimately, because we're kind of atomized and the century of the self, the sanctity of the individual, all that kind of stuff, that maybe we just be fooling ourselves that we're doing something nobler than just trying to fight for our own personal survival, for the survival of this body that we happen to inhabit. So these are some very difficult questions that I think no one can answer except for themselves, and even then, maybe without having any certainty that you've understood it properly. I just want to be 100% clear here that I am in no way talking about people taking their own lives, nor am I saying anything about the question of violence. That's not really at stake here. What we're talking about is whether or not one is able to maintain the light of the spirit in one's existence, and how to avoid descending into a kind of satanic darkness where the only thing that matters is survival. So I hope that disclaimer is clear to everyone. It's only the attachment to the entity, to the physical configuration, that causes the darkness to descend. That's just the whole story.